welcome to this panel on hydrogen pipeline safety. My name is Amanda McKay, if you haven't already seen me today running around, speaking, doing all the things. I'm the policy manager for the Pipeline Safety Trust. I'm super excited to welcome all of our panelists, and I think that we're going to have a very interesting and informative discussion today. So if you were at the conference last year, you may remember that we did have a panel on hydrogen pipelines. A lot of good discussion came out of that panel, including a lot of technical information, climate concerns, thoughts on feasibility. However, I think I'm definitely speaking for myself, but probably for others. But I know that I left with a lot of questions from that panel. I think that we all have a lot of remaining questions, so that my hope is that today we're able to address some of those ongoing questions and concerns. So while hydrogen is not a new commodity in the pipeline space, I think it's safe to say that the growing public awareness and the growing push for its use as in a clean energy future has illuminated a lot more questions regarding the safety of running hydrogen through pipelines, especially in close proximity to people. In 2021, the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act appropriated $9.5 billion for clean hydrogen, and the 2022 IRA laid additional beneficial policies and incentives for the US hydrogen industry to take center stage in the clean energy transition. And also, as many of you are probably aware, just before last year's PST conference, we published a white paper on hydrogen pipeline safety. This paper has been an excellent source of information to us as an organization, but also a great educational opportunity for concerned communities that are unsure of what questions they should be asking related to hydrogen pipelines. In 2022, the Department of Energy also announced funding for seven hydrogen hubs throughout the country, and those hub locations were announced just last month. With that announcement came a lot more questions about how these hubs will directly and indirectly affect the communities that they're planned for. What role will pipelines play in this potential build-out? What types of pipelines, how large, what pressure, will they be blended into existing natural gas systems, and many more. It is important to remember that almost all of these hydrogen projects will involve pipelines in some shape or form, and that continuing to ask questions about the technical safety aspects, the regulatory oversight, and the community engagement and education is such a critical part in ensuring the safety into the future. So, to start off, I would like to allow for all of the panelists to introduce themselves and who you work for and your connection to hydrogen pipeline safety. So, Maggie, go ahead.
Hi, everyone. I'm Maggie Coulter, and I'm the senior attorney at the Climate Law Institute for the Center for Biological Diversity. I've been working on hydrogen pipelines and hydrogen more generally in the context of our federal oil and gas work and false solutions to the climate crisis. So I have been involved most recently with the Hydrogen Hub announcements and helping to convene a coalition of local and regional groups who are dealing with what they need to be doing in the wake of these announcements, the $8 billion of funding that's been funneled into these communities, and how they can be engaged in the process going forward.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Jeff Whitworth, and I'm the director of the Emerging Fuels Institute for PRCI. A little bit about my background. I spent the majority of my career at Shell and started off working in the field for the first several years of my career, and found myself working overseas and wanted to come back, worked in the States for a while. I heard a lot of personal stories earlier today, throughout the course of the day, and I lost my parents in a non-pipeline related process safety incident, but I certainly took on a huge interest after that in causes of pipeline safety incidents since I was working in the industry. And about the same time I lost my folks, I had an opportunity to go to that area of the company within Shell, and I worked the last 20 years or so there in that group, and ended up, I was the reliability and integrity manager and really focused on improvements in process safety and been really active in PRCI. When I retired from Shell 2 years ago, the Emerging Fuels Institute was just being established to really focus on some of the topics we'll talk about here today. You know, what are the challenges around hydrogen and CO2 as we decarbonize? What can we do to do some research to close some of these gaps? And that's what I'm hoping on talking to you guys about today. So thank you for that.
Yeah, good afternoon. I'm Brian Lethcoe. I'm the Southwest Region Director for the Office of Pipeline Safety for PHMSA out of the Houston office. I've been in position for about 1 year and 4 months. I came over from another federal agency, and prior to that, I was about 20 years in industry, working various aspects of pipeline integrity, pipeline tools, and before that, I spent about 13 years in the submarine force, active duty submariner. So I've got a nuclear background, oil and gas background, and now some good regulatory work. I'm here primarily for 2 reasons. One, we have the bulk of the hydrogen assets in my region. And in addition, PHMSA has recently stood up an internal hydrogen team to include folks within PHMSA as well as some of our state partners. And I'm the sponsor for that hydrogen team as the regulator with the bulk of the assets in PHMSA. Thank you.
All right, thank you, everyone. So I'm going to just jump right into some of the questions. I think that it'd be interesting to hear a little bit from Brian and Jeff about what are the current regulations and maybe some industry standards practices that are specific to transporting hydrogen through pipelines, and then I'll have a follow-up after that.
Kick it off with Greg.
Sure. So hydrogen pipelines that we have currently in service are regulated under 49 CFR 192, which is the same regulation we use for natural gases and other gases. And gases are defined in the code to include flammable gases such as hydrogen. And so we have been regulating pipelines since 1970. Again, I've got the bulk of them in the Gulf Coast, Louisiana, Texas, down through Corpus Christi. There are some scattered throughout the U.S., but the bulk of the pipelines are in my region. We've been regulating them, like I said, since 1970 through the regulations. We are actively looking at typically these systems on about an every 3 or 5 year basis, depending on the system. And so we do maintain good oversight. Is it perfect? You know, I'd like to think it is, but it's not. In general, I think we do a pretty good job. If you look at the statistics, like for example, we talked about at the last discussion, you know, the trends are there, but we can always do better. And so understanding, you know, having the discussions at these type of conferences, understanding what the other concerns are, listening, those are the kind of things I'm hoping to do in my role to help us do better as regulators.
Thanks, Brian. And I'll speak a little bit to the standards side of the house. Folks who are in the industry are familiar with a standard called ASME 3112, and so that's the guidance document or the guidance standard for design and construction of a pipeline that's going to run hydrogen. Historically, that's been 100% hydrogen, not blends. And so I think one of the subtleties in what we're working on today is you hear a lot about blending hydrogen in existing natural gas infrastructure. And so that's kind of the gravitational epicenter of a lot of the research going on is what does this look like when you start blending hydrogen? Because I think we're all pretty well understood on what a 100% hydrogen line looks like. They're building them as we speak in Europe and in other places around the world, and we're pretty settled in what's going on there in what we consider a pretty mature environment. But in the blending side, the question is around what do you do if you put 1%, 20%, 30% in an existing natural gas system, and what's the implication there? So really a lot of the work that we're doing focuses on the potential of blending and the pros and cons around that and the implications around asset integrity, of course, safety, and things like measurement and compression as well. So thank you.
Great, thanks. That's great because I think my follow-up really plays into the blending aspect and also just what I mentioned in the introduction is just this potential massive build out. And so my follow-up is, you know, I think you alluded to this a little bit, Brian, is are the regulations sufficient for this build out? And for you, Jeff, should that ASME standard be incorporated into reference? And maybe, Brian, you can also touch on that as well.
Sure. So part of what PHMSA does on the side that I am not on, of course I'm on the field operations side, is that we have the engineering and research division. And so the last couple of years, I guess this year and 2 years ago, a lot of the thrust in the research initiatives and priorities have been looking at hydrogen, of course, and CO2 and other areas. So there's a number of current initiatives going on the research side to help inform ultimately regulation, to help understand what's necessary. What changes do we need to make as a result of a hydrogen system versus what we have for a natural gas system? Are there changes required in some of the standards? Do some of the standards require updating to account for hydrogen? And so, on the research side, these initiatives are there to help inform what regulatory changes may need to be made as part of shifting over to a more of a hydrogen type economy.
And again, thanks for the regulatory side. And in the standards side, one of the projects that the EFI is undertaking right now is taking that 3112 standard we were referencing a few minutes ago and looking at some of the base elements of it and overlaying the research results that we're coming up with currently. There's 35 ongoing funded projects within the EFI, and so as we get these results in, we're aligning those results up with the existing standard to see how the standard might need to be revised or updated, certainly with respect to blending. And so to that extent, the folks within ASME have been extremely supportive, and we're working with them hand in hand to establish a document that's basically going to be a revision to the 3112 hydrogen document so that it'll be updated and reflect the closure of the gaps that we're currently working on.
Great, thank you. And that's good foresight to what to look out for. So we're talking a little bit about this potential build out, the announcement of the DOE hydrogen hubs. With this announcement, many different communities from across the country, because there are 7 different hubs that were announced in different regions throughout the country, they're starting to wonder what this potential build out means for them. And so Maggie, maybe you can talk a little bit about some of the concerns that you're hearing. I know that that's a lot of different communities from a lot of different areas of the country, but what are you hearing from those communities?
Yeah, so one of the things that a lot of these communities are, the feedback we're hearing is that when the hub announcements were made, there were, it was a funding request for the federal government, and so these regional applicants had created community development plans, but hadn't necessarily been communicating with communities. And so the federal government is putting money towards developing a new technology that, as we're hearing, some of the standards may need to be updated, and we would argue are inadequate at this moment. We have hydrogen that it is a completely different beast than what we're typically seeing with fossil gas or methane. It burns hotter, it's more combustive, it's more corrosive. These communities are dealing with something that they've never seen before. And so when you're looking at the hydrogen hubs and the $8 billion that have gone into these applications in these different regions, they're wondering, are we going to see a new pipeline build out? What is going to be the impact of the siting of these hydrogen pipelines in our communities? Are there, as we've heard from some of the PHMSA representatives on previous panels, they aren't in control of the siting. So who is going to be looking to see that we aren't putting hydrogen pipelines next to vulnerable communities, schools, et cetera? These kinds of things are all big question marks for community members. And I think similarly, when we look at the Hydrogen Hub program, the Department of Energy, Shalonda Baker, when she was giving the day after the Hydrogen Hub announcement, gave a presentation. She's the head of the Office of Economic Impact and Diversity, and presented as a good thing that most of the hubs are being placed in disadvantaged communities, with the idea that this will be increasing jobs, but it's actually just reinforcing these disadvantaged communities or sacrifice zones that are now getting another set of infrastructure that they actually don't want. It's kind of being shoved down their throats.
You answered my follow-up question, so that's great. All right, move on. So we heard last year from industry representatives on this exact topic, and they repeated many times many, many times that significant research is needed to ensure safety. What kind of progress has been made in the last year? And Jeff, I'll hand that off to you.
Okay, thank you. Some of the folks in the room might have heard of one of the external projects that PRCI EFI is involved with called HyBlend, which is a DOE-funded project for really focused on resolving what happens to steel and also other components, the seals, gaskets, soft goods, that sort of thing, in the presence of hydrogen at certain blend levels. And so one of the big lifts in the last year anyways, that project is in its first phase, closing out. It was a 3-year project, and then recently DOE's announced funding for a HyBlend 2 project to continue on with this work. But to answer your question specifically, some of the output of that particular project that we've been working on collectively is that, first of all, blending ratio isn't really going to be one of the major factors in terms of affecting pipeline integrity. And so what I mean by that is at blend levels as low as 1%, you get about 80% of the impact of hydrogen. The embrittlement issues occur with very low blending rates. So at first we were thinking, the question historically has been 20% okay, and 20% certainly okay at the burner tip in household appliances, but what happens to a transmission pipeline operating at 72% of SMICE? And when I say 72% of SMICE, I mean it's at a high stress level that is aligned with the maximum allowable stress level that PHMSA allows. So that's where most of our natural gas pipelines operate, is at that level. And historically, folks might have heard there's companies out there that have been flowing hydrogen blends for years, and they operate at a lot lower stress level. And so when you get from that lower stress level where you don't have any issues and you start getting up into the higher stress levels, funny things start to happen where you get this embrittlement effect, where if you have defects in your pipe, you get increased crack growth rates and real problems. And so the first real takeaway, as I mentioned, so low blending rates can cause deleterious effects on your pipeline. So that's not a good thing. The good news around that, though, is that operations can manage that by lowering pressures to get to lower stress levels. And as well, one of the real causes of embrittlement and cracking is changes in pressures. So as you operate a pipeline, typically you don't just keep it at a constant level. You raise it and lower it based on operational needs and delivery needs. And so between lowering pressures and managing your pressure cycling, you can get into this envelope that's acceptable for hydrogen. The question is whether or not we have the capacity in our pipeline systems to deliver blends like that and still meet the demands of New York City to keep everybody warm in the wintertime. So those are real 30,000-foot takeaways. We've got a lot more work that we're doing. The work I just mentioned in HyBlend is all done on coupons, small-scale steel samples. And so we've recently funded a project, what we're calling full-scale testing. And so we're testing full pipeline samples with real-world defects and fabricated defects that are what we see in the real-world side of the house, dents, when you get third-party damage, that sort of thing. So great, we've got this lab work done, but what's going to happen when we put these real-world defects? We want to make sure that we don't base any future standards or regulations on what we saw as a small-scale coupon test, and we're going to ultimately expand that to a more time-consuming and costly full-scale test that we're just now embarking upon. And HyBlend 2 will be indirectly linked with that. The work that we're doing there is going to be based from the EFI, but HyBlend 2 is actually doing some what they call subscale testing on some 2-inch pipe to do the same thing. So we're connecting dots right now to try to get to that next level, but that's kind of where the initial takeaway is. A lot of it's not necessarily new information if you've been tracking hydrogen for 20 years, but that's the big level high takeaway for safety.
Great, thank you. Next question is a little bit for Brian, probably. So for gas distribution blending projects, which we know there are some out there that are happening, there are pilots that are being proposed. How do we account for the pipeline infrastructure that is outside of PHMSA or state pipeline safety programs jurisdictions, such as inside people's homes?
Yeah, so like you mentioned, there are some pilot projects that are out there. As part of the hydrogen team I'm on, we've had a couple operators present to us the work that they're doing. One of which is a test facility where they basically simulate a town, and they provide blended hydrogen to those to the town to verify that the materials that they have in place as part of on the distribution side can handle the the blend, the appliances can handle the blend. But to your point, asking the question, what else can you do to support those simulated homes? Is there any sort of detection you do? Hydrogen detection. And the answer came back, we do have those in place, but it wasn't clear that there's a desire to push those to the homes by the utility. I mean, I would like to think that they would, but that's just Brian's opinion. As an extra mitigation, just in case of an issue, because issues do happen. Unfortunately, people make mistakes, things happen. And so having those additional layers of protection would be useful. I will say there's another pilot project that's going on where they're actually delivering blended hydrogen to commercial and residential customers. And the same sort of issue, the operator has felt that there's not a need to do that at this point and for this specific project. And so keep asking the question. As a regulator, we'll ask those questions. We may not be able to regulate it, but we can certainly tell them, hey, we're interested in seeing you, do things a little bit better than what the regulation is. The regulation is the minimum standard for safety. I'd like to see folks go above that where they can. And this would be a case where they should, in my opinion.
Thank you for that. And a little bit of a curveball here, talking about hydrogen detection. What type of industry or governmental research has been done on hydrogen detection, leak detection, or in-home detectors?
So there are currently, as part of the research projects we have on hydrogen, one of the projects is related to taking current industry hydrogen detectors and understanding the capability to detect on pipeline systems. So we do have current R&D at PHMSA looking into that. I guess I'd pass it to you for.
No, we're shadowing that work, and then there's similar work going on in Australia and in Europe. There's two other peer organizations that look like EFI. One of them's EPRG in Europe, and the other one's Future Fuels in Australia. And so we all have a memo of understanding together, and we collectively share each other's roadmaps and our work. And so there's ongoing parallel work in the leak detection space, and we elected early on within PRCI to say we're not in the technology business, but we're certainly into the vetting of the technology business, and so that's effectively what we're doing is we're looking at the technologies, and right now I think that is a solution that seems to be at a comfort level that's better or higher than some of the other issues around integrity. So the answer is everybody seems to be working in a direction to land that one pretty safely.
All right, thank you. All right, so the next question is for all the panelists, and maybe we'll start with Maggie. Last year we heard someone say during a panel on hydrogen pipelines that environmental policy has to follow safety policy. How do we ensure that safety is at the forefront of this potential build-out? And given hydrogen's role as an indirect greenhouse gas, how do we ensure that the deployment of hydrogen will contribute towards the climate solution as intended? It's a big question.
Yeah, you could have a whole conference on that question. So I don't know where to start. So
you can repeat anything you need.
No, that's all right. So as we've heard, there's all kinds of safety issues with hydrogen that we're in the research stage at. We are looking at the embrittlement of pipelines when you're doing blending, and those are typically steel pipelines that have been transporting methane or natural gas or fossil gas. And then we're looking at what a pipeline might look like if we were just transmitting hydrogen alone in that pipeline. Those are two of the questions that you think about with pipelines and hydrogen. There's a whole host of additional storage and combustion of hydrogen questions and safety concerns that you need to evaluate. At the very least, looking at where we're going to store hydrogen, it's not always possible to store it where you're wanting to use it. That will necessitate additional pipelines or transport by rail or by truck. And so every level of the hydrogen process needs oversight and needs regulation. And at this moment, the regulatory environment has not caught up at all to this massive proposed build-out of hydrogen. And so I think when you're asking, can the safety policy drive the environmental policy, I think we are seeing that that's not happening. Safety is coming second right now. And when we're talking about is hydrogen build out an environmental policy, it's not actually going to be reducing greenhouse gas emissions. To create the hydrogen and then either to burn it, it is less energy efficient than using a fossil gas. Because at this moment, we don't have hydrogen out there that we can just be grabbing and burning. We're making it, and we're making it out of fossil fuels. And so there's a whole host of reasons why the federal government's massive funding push, $8 billion for hydrogen production hubs, and then another $1.5 billion to create demand for hydrogen, is the cart leading the horse.
Anyone else is welcome to take that question if you'd like.
I don't have much to say about environmental before safety and vice versa. It depends on whether, I guess, you're a lawyer or an engineer. I mean, from an engineer's perspective, we always took safety first before environmental. That was around the corner, down the hall kind of thing. But you raise a point about the construction of these facilities and the new, potentially new pipelines that are going to connect storage with production with usage. And I think one of the elephants in the room in the last few discussions I've been involved with is centered around, you start doing the math and you realize it's hard to make this whole thing connect up and work without new assets being built. And so I've been hearing it on and off all day. And you know, if we're serious about the climate accords and the G7 decisions that have been made in Paris and all that sort of stuff, it all points to new assets. And I knew that's where this common ground or these discussions need to center on, is if we're serious about decarbonizing or reducing our carbon footprint, how do we do that in an effective and safe manner? And there's a lot of balls in the air on that. And certainly we need to continue this discussion around it. I don't have a solution except for to say I'm not sure we can get there without new assets. And if the starting point is no new assets, then we don't ever decarbonize. And so where do we end up? And rhetorical question, of course.
I'll just add that, you know, the primary mission of PHMSA is safety of the public. And so, you know, I don't believe that we'll take our eye off the ball for safety. There are a number of things that we are doing in addition to our regulatory work, like I mentioned on the R&D side, which actually directly relates to a number of the points you brought up. You know, decision support around what assets may be able to best converted to service, to hydrogen service is a project that we're working, looking at embrittlement issues and the effect of hydrogen on pipes, which, you know, currently hold you know, natural gas, looking and ensuring that the welding processes can be done safely for hydrogen pipelines, also as well as hydrogen storage, underground storage research. So there's a number of things that the agency is doing on the research side to address those concerns. But at the end of the day, you know, the folks that work for me in my region, our job is to ensure the safety of the public. So we won't keep our eye off of that ball.
Can I add just one additional thing? And this is outside of your purview, but it is something that directly affects the communities where any kind of pipeline are being, new assets are being developed or installed. And that's that when you have pipeline construction, there's a disruption to ecosystems and communities, and we've seen, there's a study that shows there's a 70% increase in violence in those communities, particularly targeting indigenous women. And so this is something that is a safety issue outside of PHMSA's purview, but that is an extremely huge impact on a local community that is subject to this kind of infrastructure build out.
Yeah, thank you for that. And I guess maybe to kind of bring up what Maggie said earlier about whether or not we're putting the cart before the horse, maybe something that Jeff and Brian could provide some perspective on is just the speed at which this research is happening. You know, obviously, I don't think anyone here wants to rush research. We don't want to rush answers if we need to take the time to get the right answers. However, we are seeing this push for a build out of hydrogen. And so how do we balance the need for taking our time to do the research, but also knowing that the build out is coming?
Take that or me?
Start? No.
Okay. So just a case in point, I guess, when we first started the EFI in 2020, it was a 3-year horizon, and now it's the end of 2023, and we're just about done with that horizon. And there's certainly been some questions around, well, can't we go faster? And I've had the support of the leaders and the membership to say, look, we can't do this overnight, and so we're looking for a 3-year extension right now. The point is we're going to do, our time horizon is going to be whatever it takes to get the right answer, and the correct answer, I guess, is what I mean. And the idea being that if we're not done yet, we're not going to make a decision to say, well, it's time to start building, so we got to go without the horse. That's not a possibility. So I think from that perspective, it's good. The Future Fuels folks, they had a 5-year funding commitment from their government in Australia, and they're just sunsetting this next year in 2024, and they're as well looking for another 5 years. So I think we all started off in earnest thinking, we're going to solve these problems and be on about our business, but ideally what we're now realizing is no, it's going to take a longer runway to accomplish some of these tasks, and for various reasons. But so I think to answer your question is, we're going to take whatever time it's necessary to make sure we do it right. And I say we, I'm talking about the academia we're working with and the research organizations, the consultants that we use that all collectively do this work together.
And I guess I just would follow up to say that there would probably need to be somebody maybe on the regulatory side within my leadership. If we do get too far ahead of ourselves, they need to be able to have the authority to say stop. And sometimes that's hard. We don't always have that authority. We have PHMSA as an agency has safety authority as well as regulatory authority over pipelines. So it would be perhaps my boss's boss, Alan, who's here, who would put his foot down and say stop, or Tristan, who will be with us tomorrow. If we find ourselves too far out ahead, it may take some courage of leadership to do that.
Great, thank you for that. All right. Oftentimes, it seems like in the case of hydrogen pipelines, the public has very few opportunities for input on the matter. And I think that as the Pipeline Safety Trust, we try and represent the public and the public's concerns. And so this is near and dear to our heart, is how can we ensure an informed and engaged public as this technology moves forward and as these potential regulations move forward. And this is for all the panelists, so whoever wants to take it first.
Sure. I can start by saying that, there's a conception in the general public that, hydrogen, like you think of a hydrogen fuel cell car, all it emits is water. Water or steam into the atmosphere can is an indirect greenhouse gas on its own. And we have to think through all of the pieces of the puzzle. And so I think there's got to be kind of an education component to why are we putting all this money and time and energy into, energy, no pun intended, into trying to develop this industry that doesn't exist, that doesn't need to exist, that we have existing processes and renewable energy. If we were to take $8 billion and put it into the deployment of deployment and expansion of renewables, would we be better off in the long run? So there's a whole host of questions that come into play there. I think that's where I would start, is looking at why are we putting all of the energy into propping up this kind of industry.
Yeah, I guess I would add that, in terms of ensuring that, the public is engaged and informed, this, like Alan mentioned this morning, this year has been a pretty interesting year for PHMSA in terms of our public meetings. We had a meeting in Iowa a few months ago. I didn't attend that one, but, it was apparently a very well attended and very informative meeting for the folks who did attend. We also had a public information session down in Freeport back in February where I did present, the initial findings from the incident. And we've had some follow-on discussions with local folks down in Freeport to continue to have them understand our process, have them understand the things we look at as regulators, the kind of things that we as PHMSA, FERC, and Coast Guard in this case, came together to ensure the safe restart of that facility. We were able to keep those folks informed. They would come, one of our community liaisons in the back, Jay Prothero, gets a lot of calls, and we've met with local folks, and we are attempting to be more proactive in engagement where we can. And so this year broke it loose for PHMSA. We understand that meeting with folks face-to-face, hearing their concerns, is better than not doing that, clearly.
Yeah, I'm not sure I have as good an answer, except for to say, we started this EFI 3 years ago, and I sat next to Bill on a similar panel like this in DC about 18 months ago. And earlier this year, I talked to Cliff, the president of PRCI, and said, well, why aren't we all working together a little closer? And so we asked Bill to come on, and he gave the keynote at our annual research meeting, PRCI's annual research meeting, and then, of course, he reciprocated, and here I am today. So that's the tip of the iceberg, though. I think, the question is if you're sitting there as a public citizen, as, by the way, I am one, right? I live in a community. Safety is just as important to me as it is important to everybody in the audience here. And so how do we get folks who may be interested, how do we get connected? I don't know the answer to that, except for to say we have no qualms about inviting folks to our research meetings, which happen, it's in February in San Diego, our annual research meeting, so where we share all of the key information of the key results of our research that we've done in the last year. And so certainly that's never, it's as far as I'm concerned, it's a public invitation, but how do we make the connections there? So I think we've made the first step by being more involved with PST and vice versa, but how do we get to that next layer? And I haven't really put a lot of thought in that.
Great, thank you. All right, so the last question from me, and then we'll pass it to the audience for questions. Talking a lot about questions. What questions should we continue to ask ourselves moving forward? It seems like, we've heard a lot that there's still more research to be done. There's still more community education and action that needs to happen. There's potential regulations that need to be looked at. So from your perspective, what questions do we continue to ask ourselves, and what do the next 1 to 5 years look like?
Sure, I'll start. I was going to add that when you're thinking about educating the public, that PST has a really great resource on hydrogen. If you have no idea why you should be caring about it or what its role, if any, should be in the next 5 years in our managing our carbon budget, you should check out their report. But I think broadly, we're going to be seeing the policy question of whether we should be investing in hydrogen has been answered for us. The federal government, Congress, has put money towards this. And now what we do with that is, do we accept that this is going to be shoved down the throats of some local communities, or can we push back in such a way? And like we were saying, it's going to take somebody up high in control having the fortitude to say that this isn't the right time, this isn't ready yet, because we're seeing it's not only not ready, but it might not be necessary. And those would be what I'm looking for in the next 5 years, and it's going to take a very well-informed public to be able to push back, because it sounds innocuous, it sounds helpful, and that's why we've gotten to this point so far. And it's going to take a lot more of educating not just the public, we have a very well-educated public, but also our legislators and our congresspeople and people in the communities where this is going to be directly affecting.
Please. Thank you. So next 1 to 5 years, or even beyond, I touched earlier on this infrastructure issue, but in the shorter term window, I think we've got to continue to lock down on our answers to say we're in or we're out. Because there's got to be some decisions made at some point. You reach a fork in the road and say, are we going to risk this, or do we have the risk mitigated to say we feel comfortable with it? And the message I've taken away today, and this is my first PST conference, is you get a lot wider variance of inputs. And so to get everybody happy, you have to make sure that you manage that risk to a level that everybody says we're good with this. And there's a lot of moving parts around that, around social justice and things that aren't necessarily technical. So it's hard to predict what's going to happen around those corners, but in the end, from a technical perspective, I think we're going to get to a point, and the guy the representative for High Blend sitting in the room, I won't point him out, but I've always said, knows an answer. If we can't get our head around this to blend hydrogen in an existing pipeline system and new infrastructures, the only option for really doing it safely, or the most safe manner, I guess, knows an answer. We might spend a ton of money getting to that point, but that's always been an answer. Yes isn't always the answer when you're doing research. And so from that perspective, I'd say it's hard to say what we're going to come to. Are we hopeful? Yeah, that's our goal, is to solve these problems. That's why we're in business to do what we do as engineers, is solving problems, not coming 5 years later and spending millions of dollars saying, sorry, we couldn't do it. I mean, I said the other day, we sent a guy to the moon in 1962. Kennedy says we're going to be there by the end of the decade, and we did it. Well, you'd think we could solve this problem. Can we? I would hope so. We got a lot of smart people sitting out here in the audience. So I think we can do that in the next 1 to 5 years. There's this infrastructure question, and when you look at hydrogen, and if we say, look, we're going to really displace natural gas with hydrogen, then you have the whole heat content of hydrogen, and there's just absolutely hands down a necessity. We need new pipelines for that. Not to replace old pipelines, it just has a third of the BTU value. You can't, if you say we're going to send hydrogen to New York City on the Transco system with 5 huge pipelines with hydrogen, 2/3 of the people in New York are going to go cold and be hanging out their neighbor's house that do have heat. So, how do you manage those little sorts of issues? And yeah, there's increased compression and there's faster flow rates and that sort of thing, but it's a sticky wicket that we can all solve together, but the stakeholders in this room need to be part of that solution, and we need to hold hands along the way, because our policymakers, I thought, when they said solving global warming was #1, I figured, well, everybody in the community is going to take that as the guiding light. That's their North Star, regardless of how many miles of pipeline we got to build. But if people are saying, no, we're not going to build pipelines, and we're still going to live with that, then, what's the answer? Where do we get to that conclusion? And those are the unknowns that are still going to keep me interested over the next 5 years. I'm supposed to be retired, but this is really fun. So thank you for your time.
I guess I'd say from the next 1 to 5 year time horizon, from the enforcement perspective, we'll continue our oversight. The field operations folks in my region, as well as in the other regions who have hydrogen assets, will continue to do our job, which is to oversee the operation and the maintenance and everything that goes with the transportation of natural gas and other gases. A lot of R&D projects are in progress, and some of those will continue to progress and eventually wrap up, and that will probably inform new rulemaking. I would anticipate in that 1 to 5 year time horizon there'll be some sort of additional rulemaking which either incorporates by reference 3112 or what we've learned in the R&D projects. And so I would imagine that the agency would be putting something out in that same time horizon. And as the build out happens, hopefully it's done in a proper stepwise manner. Or otherwise, we'll need someone to say no.
Great. Thank you so much to all the panelists. We're going to open it up to questions from the audience. One in the middle here.
And if you could please just introduce yourself so we can all be friends and know who's asking the question, please.
Hi, my name's Eric Roach. I work for a small gas and electric utility. I just have a quick question. What is the cost comparison look like, pure methane gas versus a blended? Because the cost of, it sounds like it's not easy to produce hydrogen. And so how is that going to roll down to the end user? I'm just kind of curious.
You're the legal person.
Thank you.
I'm going to say I don't know, actually. I don't know the answer to, I think you were talking about yeah, FERC's gonna know whether or not, or is gonna govern whether or not that the regulated entity is gonna be able to pass the cost along to the consumer for the development or the purchase of the hydrogen. I don't think any of the utilities are gonna be hydrogen producers. And that's what I would say. But does somebody know about the Hawaii project, what they're doing there? Maybe you have an answer.
No, I do not have the answer. I mean, they've been, well, Pat might know something, he's raising his hand.
More globally, is it true that the cost will be more than just transporting natural gas?
The cost to transport, I don't think will be a whole lot different. Yeah.
So there is a pilot project up in Minnesota where they are developing hydrogen through electrolysis. They're using, they're calling it green hydrogen. They're pulling from the grid, but they're buying from renewable sources. And it is not, I would say it certainly isn't cost effective. In other words, they're doing it to demonstrate that they can do it. It certainly costs a lot more than just delivering natural gas to the end user.
And I would also just add the combustion of methane versus hydrogen. Methane will always have more energy output. So that will also be a factor. And when you're doing blending, if you have a high blend version, it's going to have less energy output, or less BTUs than you would with a fossil gas.
I don't know if that answered your question before Pat answered asked his question. Okay. But yeah, there's no FERC decision on that recovery process. Not sure where they are on that. Anybody with FERC?
All right, next question.
Hi, my name is Jade Woods. I am with the Center for International Environmental Law, and I'm really interested in what y'all were talking about earlier with the ongoing research around leak detection for hydrogen, and I was wondering if you could just speak more to that. Have there been any early findings about how leaks could be reported or leak detection technology? Yeah, thanks.
I don't have the specifics on that, but I can, if you want to get with me afterwards, I've got a link which we can send to you to the PHMSA site where that research information's housed.
And I don't have much to offer except there's a whole aspect too that assuming that you have the technology in your hand, there's a question about how the frequency and what does a day in the life of a pipeline operator look like, whether you're a distribution system or transmission system. In your operating manual, right now we do monthly leak detection surveys along the pipeline. Of course, you've got everything being monitored from a loss perspective in your control rooms, but those are, generally speaking, larger volume losses that you're going to pick up in mass balance. But if you're looking for tiny little leaks, the question, I would guess that if you're in a hydrogen operations condition, you're probably going to monitor your line more frequently. But the first question I think you're asking is, you got to have the technology in your hand that works. And at the highest level, hydrogen's a flammable gas, so is natural gas, and when you're running along with a flame ionization unit, they're both going to pick up a leak. The question is how small a leak? And so that's really what we're, just like putting hydrogen in a pipeline, how small a crack your ally tool needs to detect smaller cracks because they grow faster under hydrogen conditions. So same kind of thing exists, or same presumptions exist with the hydrogen leak detection. And that's what we're trying to get our heads around, don't have an answer to yet.
Hi, sorry if you covered this, but I had to show up late. But staying with leak, was there any discussion about like secondary atmospheric reactions with increased hydrogen in the atmosphere and durability of methane?
No, but hydrogen is an indirect greenhouse gas.
Yeah, well, it also interferes with the hydroxyl reaction that brings methane down, which is the only blessing that we have from methane. So sloppy hydrogen cooks us faster than carbon.
Yeah, I was in a discussion last night with this real smart guy, and he brought up the same exact concept about hydroxyls and the benefit, right, that natural gas has versus potentially you could have more greenhouse net impact with hydrogen. But if you want to talk to somebody who knows about that, he's sitting on the second row right here. Good-looking guy, looks like Fabio.
I'll steal the mic for last question. I'm curious about reporting requirements from PHMSA. I think if you've read our report or any of the information that we've put out, that's a serious concern that we have, is that operators are not required to report any level of blending within their system. And so, you know, if we're talking about pilot projects or utilities that are potentially already doing this, how do we know? Are we just trusting them to tell PHMSA and giving them a heads up, or should we be looking at adding a reporting requirement for blending?
Yeah, it's a good question. I would imagine, don't quote me on this, but as part of the rulemaking that comes out, that should come out in the 1 to 5 year time horizon, that adding additional data elements to the reporting would be a critical piece of information.
We will wrap up there. Thank you again to all of the panelists. You did a great job.